Hello everyone and welcome. Today we're going to dive into a really short but incredibly dense passage from the Quran. It starts right in the middle of a chaotic battlefield, a moment where everything was about to go completely wrong. But then it just pivots and lays down these foundational laws for the entire community. It's this amazing journey from crisis to constitution. So let's get right into it.
This question right here, this is really the heart of the story that kicks off our passage. It's a gripping account of how confidence, the kind of confidence you get when you have overwhelming numbers on your side, can just suddenly flip and become the very thing that brings you to the edge of disaster. So the setting for all this is the Battle of Hunayn. This is happening right after the historic conquest of Mecca. The early Muslim community, well, they've gathered the largest army they have ever had. So you'd think this would be a story of a huge triumph, right? But verse 25 tells a totally different story. It's actually a really stark warning about that one moment when their greatest strength almost led them to total defeat. And here on this slide, you can see the core psychological lesson laid out so clearly. The community was feeling good, maybe even a little overconfident about their massive army. The thinking was basically, look at us, there's no way we can lose with these numbers. But then a surprise attack hits, and all that confidence just evaporates. The verse is brutal. It says their numbers meant nothing. Panic just erupted, and people started to flee.
This line right here is just an incredible piece of psychological poetry. Just think about that for a second. They're in a wide open valley, but their fear is so intense, so overwhelming, that the verse says the whole earth felt confining. It's a perfect description of how panic can literally shrink your world, making you feel completely trapped even when you have all the space in the world to move.
But of course, the story doesn't end in panic and retreat. Right at that critical moment of human failure, the passage describes a divine intervention that completely flips the script.
And the very first part of that intervention is something called sakina. Now, this is a really important concept to get. It's not just about, feeling calm. It's described as a divine tranquility, a deep reassurance sent down from God to steady everyone right in the middle of all that chaos. It's basically the perfect antidote to the panic that had just taken over.
And you got to notice the sequence here. First, the internal change happens. Sakina comes down and restores calm and morale. Then comes the external help. The text mentions unseen hosts, which is often understood to mean angels or some other kind of invisible reinforcements. It's this 1-2 punch of inner peace followed by outer aid that ultimately turns the battle around.
And then, after the battle was won, verse 27 adds this other critical layer. It perfectly balances the justice of the battlefield with a powerful reminder of divine mercy. It makes it really clear that, yeah, there are consequences for hostility, but the door to forgiveness and mercy is always open. It's such a compassionate note right at the end of a military story.
Okay, so get ready for a big shift here. The passage makes a major pivot. We're leaving the battlefield behind, and we're moving to the sacred heart of the community in Makkah. Verse 28 introduces a new, really important rule about who can have access to the sacred mosque. That's the area right around the Kaaba.
Now, to really understand this new rule, we have to define a key term here. The verse describes polytheists as najas. But, and this is crucial, scholarly sources are really clear that this doesn't mean physically dirty or anything like that. It's referring to a spiritual impurity, specifically related to their beliefs. The whole point was to preserve the Kaaba as a center purely for monotheistic worship.
So what did this actually mean in practice? Well, polytheists wouldn't have ritual access to the sacred mosque anymore. But what's so fascinating is that the verse immediately anticipates the community's real-world fear. You can almost hear them thinking, wait a minute, what about the economy? We're going to lose all that trade from the pilgrimages. And the text addresses this head-on, reassuring them that God will provide. It just goes to show how this rule was both theological and deeply pragmatic.
And that brings us to our final section, which covers verse 29. Now, I have to say, according to the source material we're looking at, this is one of the most frequently misunderstood verses in the entire Quran. So it is absolutely essential that we approach it with the deep context that scholars, both classical and contemporary, provide.
So here's the text of the verse itself. It talks about fighting certain groups until they give the jizya. Now, read on its own, you can see how this could sound really open-ended and concerning. But as we're about to see, the scholarly tradition puts this verse within some very, very specific boundaries. So how is this verse actually understood? Well, mainstream scholarly interpretation is incredibly firm on this. It is not a license for random violence, not at all.
Instead, it's seen as a legal ruling for a very specific 7th century political and military situation. It was directed at hostile groups who had broken treaties, and it was all tied to the authority of a state to create a political settlement after a war.
And what about that word jizya? What is it? Well, historically, this was a specific kind of tax that existed in classical Islamic states. Think of it like a contractual arrangement. In return for paying this tax, non-Muslim communities were granted protection by the state, and they were also exempt from military service. It was basically a tool of governance from a very particular historical system.
So when you step back and look at the whole thing, this short passage really has two completely distinct halves. We start with this incredibly dramatic story about faith and fear on a battlefield, and we end with these very specific laws about sacred space and political agreements. And the one thing that connects it all? The absolute, undeniable need for context.
It really is a journey in two parts, isn't it? The first few verses give us this powerful human story about humility and faith, and then, boom, the passage completely shifts gears into legal and political rules. In just a handful of lines, we've gone from a story about the human heart to a blueprint for the state. It just shows you how spiritual and practical the text aims to be, all at once.
And all of this leaves us with a much bigger question to think about, one that goes beyond just this passage. From the panic in that valley to the legal rulings that followed, it is so clear that understanding the original situation is everything. So it's worth asking ourselves, how does digging into the historical context of any foundational text change the way we read its message today? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me.